You're watching BizCheck. We are live from Broadcasting House. This is what we do every Thursday, and we are back now. We have been talking about the cryptocurrency and what you need to know in order for you to get into this space. Highly sophisticated, and of course it requires you to be armed with the right information. Now we want to switch gears and talk about trade and investment matters. And now I want to take you back to the year 2020 when former US President Donald Trump told the world that Washington and Nairobi were talking to craft what was being billed back then as the model of free trade agreements in Africa. Of course, Donald Trump left the office without seeing the trade agreement reached. And therein came Joseph Biden, or Joe Biden. He has restarted the talks. And of course, we know for sure that the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has been in Kenya before to try and see ways of accelerating these negotiations. We know that Kenya's Trade Cabinet Secretary, Moses Kuria, dispatched a team to Washington last month, actually, to try and see whether they can fast-track these agreements. We are yet to know the results of their conversations. Joining us this morning to help us get a clear perspective on where we are and the importance of these discussions is Maxwell Okello. He's the CEO of AmCham. AmCham, for your information, is the American Chamber of Commerce, joining us this morning. Thank you very much indeed, Maxwell, for joining us. First of all, help us understand what is AmCham, number one, and where are you involved in this whole matrix of trying to craft a trade deal between Nairobi and Washington?
All right, thank you very much, O'Brien, for having me this morning. Just real quick, the American Chamber of Commerce is a network of American and Kenyan businesses that are invested and committed on the bilateral commercial relationship between Kenya and the US. And what we do is primarily drive and support commercial promotion between our two countries. And of course, to do that, you need to be able to effectively intervene in matters relating to the policy environment that would help drive greater trade and investment. And so, to your question around the free trade area, or famously known as the FTA, you're right in the sense that this was initiated by President Donald Trump previously. But with the change in administration, with the Biden administration coming into play, they had to take a pause and review what had been negotiated then. I think Kenya had had about 2 rounds of negotiations by that time. And I think towards mid last year, there was an announcement that Kenya will be restarting, Kenya and the US will be restarting that process, but in the form of a strategic trade and investment partnership. And so that is what...
Instead of an FTA.
Instead of an FTA. But I would look at it as more a pathway towards perhaps eventually a free trade agreement.
Why do you think there was a change of mind? Because there was a feeling that it was some sort of a downgrade from an FTA, because an FTA is a more serious arrangement as opposed to a strategic agreement.
Yeah, I think, some of these things, it's a little difficult to really understand what happens in the background. But I want to believe that the intent is still there, it's still the same, and sometimes it's just a different path towards that eventual outcome that we are looking for. Such trade agreements tend to be a government-to-government affair. It's a government-to-government negotiation. And because of that, there are certain factors that come into play that could be priorities, for example, of the new administration. Actually, in this case, both administrations were new coming into this. And so that could be one of the reasons that caused that sort of pivot. But as I said, I firmly believe, or we firmly believe as the American Chamber of Commerce, that this is just one phase of several steps that could eventually end up with a more comprehensive trade arrangement between Kenya and the US.
I mean, you see, you're talking about the year 2020 when both countries, Kenya and the US, announced that they are starting discussions on how to establish an FTA. So much water has gone under the bridge. The world, as we know it today, is not the same as it was then in 2020. Therein came the COVID-19 pandemic, the global economic crisis. Now we are dealing with another crisis triggered by the geopolitics of the Ukraine-Russia war. Do you still think it is tenable to have an FTA between Kenya and the US modeled on the platform of the year 2020?
Well, maybe not modeled on the year 2020, but the reality is that we find ourselves in. This, I want to believe, is a dynamic process. And the dynamism that we're talking about here should be at the heart of what drives these sort of engagements, these sort of agreements. And so I want to believe that there will be due consideration to the environment that we find ourselves in from a business perspective. However, I think an important consideration that we have to always bear in mind is that such trade arrangements are about the long term. It's not about the here and now. It's about what can we achieve using such a platform over the next 5, 10, and so many more years for the benefit of the trade and investment relationship between countries.
You see, when you look at the two-way trade numbers between Kenya and the US, you're talking about 1.2 billion US dollars, worth of trade every year, and so you're talking about 130 billion Kenya shillings. In American terms, that is definitely nothing. It's just a drop in the ocean. But of course, in Kenya, those are big numbers. Do you believe Washington is still committed to this cause?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Where do you base your argument from?
Well, if you look at the sort of activity, the reinvigoration, if I may put it that way, of our commercial relationship with the US, over and above, the political and cultural relationships that we've had over a period of time. Choosing to still proceed, go forward with some form of trade arrangement, they could have chosen not to do that. Then secondly, and now speaking purely from a private sector perspective, we continue to see quite a bit of interest in Kenya as a market in itself, but also as a hub for American multinationals for the region. And so just those two indicators, as far as I'm concerned, point towards a commitment and a willingness to see how we can deepen the commercial engagement between our two countries. And as you know, business follows opportunity. It's just that simple. If it's not Kenya, it could be another country. But right now, the spotlight is being shined on Kenya. And so we want to make sure that we take advantage of this opportunity so that we can maximize as a country, and of course as a private sectors that are here, this attention and the foreign direct investment that could potentially result from this. And
you see, the US is, has not been in talks with Kenya only when it comes to addressing or getting into an FTA kind of an agreement here in Africa. I mean, they have done it with Ghana, they've done it with Egypt, they have done it with South Africa. Why do you think the Kenyan model has taken too long to be implemented? I know you say that there was a change of regime, but there was no change of government in Washington.
Well, the government sets the agenda, right? The government does set the agenda, and so it is not. It is not anything that is unusual for the government of the day to review what had been done by the previous governments. However, moving away from there, and I really don't want to purport to be speaking on behalf of the American government here. Moving away from there, from that, trade negotiations do take a while. We've seen that. We've seen that all over the world. And in Africa, just to clarify, the US has only one free trade agreement, and that's with Morocco. There was attempt, rightly so, to do one with South Africa, that fell through. I'm not so sure what the reasons were. So Kenya would have been the first in sub-Saharan Africa had it gone through in the form of an FTA. But like I said, that for us, that particular ambition, that particular dream is still alive. I think we are taking steps towards that through this strategic trade and investment partnership. And the reason why we are really behind that, why we support that, is because we think that having a formalized, comprehensive, stable trade agreement with the US will be transformational for this country.
Will be transformational.
Exactly, and creation of jobs as well.
Well, in case you're just joining us here in studio, we are having this conversation with Maxwell Okello. He's the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce. Our conversation revolves around the Kenya-US trade relations. And the question that we're asking ourselves is Washington serious when it comes to dealing with Nairobi? That is a question that we're asking ourselves. How important is Nairobi as a trade ally for Washington? We know militarily and, of course, diplomatically, Kenya or Nairobi is a critical hub for Washington. But what about trade-wise? That is why we're having the AmCham CEO, Maxwell Okello. He's helping us to understand how critical Nairobi is to Washington when it comes to matters of trade. And I do agree with you that when it comes to an FTA, it is only Morocco in Africa that has an FTA with the US. But we know for sure that the US has entered into strategic trade relations with South Africa, with Ghana, and now they want to do the same with Kenya. I mean, how do you expect this to be different or to be radical from the kind of strategic relations they have with Pretoria and with Accra?
Yeah, I think looking at this purely from a business perspective, and that's what I want to focus my remarks on. As I said, for us, let me give you two perspectives here. Let me look at it as a Kenyan, and from a Kenyan private sector perspective. It is important for us to have stability in the form of a predictable trade arrangement with the US. Think of the US as this locomotive that has really transformed several countries. You know, talk about South Korea, Vietnam, and so on. I mean, that list is endless. You want to have a trade arrangement that is comprehensive, that allows for FDI to come into this country in the sort of numbers that we would like to see, that is actually transformational.
And what are these numbers?
Well, these numbers we wait to see, right? I'm sure you saw what the sort of quote that CS Moses Kuria gave, that Kenya would like to see. I think it's what, over 100 billion in terms of foreign direct investment in Kenya. I need to remember that particular figure properly. I hope I've quoted it right. But where will that come from? It can only come from deliberate and concerted efforts such as this to create an environment that if you're sitting in the US as a company, as an investor who's looking for opportunities, and Africa is truly that next frontier. So if you're coming to Africa, where do you park your investment? There are very few countries that you can really talk about. And I think Kenya is right up there. As I said, because of our location, because of all this great stuff that we've done from an infrastructure perspective, the connectivity and so on, Kenya is the perfect hub for companies to come set up for the Kenyan market and the regional markets as well. And so I think that is a key driver for what we are seeing happening now.
Tell me things. Next year, there will be elections in the US. God knows who will be the president. It is not yet clear whether, Joseph Biden will vie. And if he doesn't, then, somebody else will come into the office. And God knows, what kind of policies they'll put in place. And of course, just like any other new administration, when you come into power, you have to make changes within your government. And so you cannot sit here guaranteed that, Catherine Tai will still be the trade representative for the US, post-2024. And so this is likely to be another setback for these negotiations if they will not be concluded by then. So what do we need to do to accelerate this conversation, these trade negotiations? Is there anything that Nairobi can do, honestly?
I think again, speaking as someone who's proximate to what is happening with these negotiations, I think that willingness and the commitment from the Kenyan government is clearly demonstrable. We've also seen the willingness and the commitment from the US government to push this along. And so, the most we can do is to wait and see. From a private sector, we keep advocating engagements such as this, allow us to just shine a little more light on why this is important and how it can be transformational for our country. And so, we keep doing our bit, keeping that dialogue alive, and then hope that the governments and the negotiating teams can work through this in the fastest period possible. So I can't predict the future, but I want to hold that hope that this will see the cross line, the finishing line, excuse me. So
we know for sure, and we understand, the concept of lobbying in Washington, whereby, various companies, various countries, institutions, they employ the services of lobbyists in Washington that are strong, that are powerful, to drive their agenda. And we know this happens even in the House of Representatives, even in Congress, whereby, you tap the services of various lobbyists to drive and to push your agenda. From where you sit, do you think this is a strategy that Nairobi can employ?
And I want to believe that it is also happening.
It is happening.
I want to believe so. I'm not saying that.
Your belief is based on what?
It's just the way this kind of negotiations work. Yeah, you want to be able to. We, as the American Chamber of Commerce and our partners in the US through the US Chamber are always talking this up in various engagements that we have. And I want to also believe that the Kenya government is smart enough to know that you need to be able to engage at various levels to build that sort of support to be able to move this forward. So, and this I'm speaking purely from our perspective. The Kenya government can verify this, but I want to trust that they are deploying such strategies as well to ensure that they are able to move this forward.
So you're trusting, but you do not know?
I'm trusting that the right things are being done so that we can move this forward.
It's going to move forward. Help us understand this. And the whole point is to diversify our offering to the American markets, because we are very strong when it comes to apparel because of AGOA agreement, which unfortunately is elapsing in 2025.
Yes.
And so Nairobi is trying to place itself strategically so that you can have more offering to the American markets, because, let's face it, Kenya has the best black tea in the world. Kenyan coffee is the best in the world. Our flowers are unrivaled. And so, for us to access to have a wider reach of the American market, we need to get, into special arrangement. What is the role of the private sector in ensuring that this agenda is driven forward?
Yeah, I think this is any trade agreement or arrangement, as much as it is negotiated between governments, is all about the private sector.
Exactly.
Yeah, the locus of actually implementing that is incumbent on the private sector. Yeah. And so what do we need to do as a private sector? We actually need to pay attention. We need to interrogate what the opportunities are and position ourselves to take those opportunities. So if you take AGOA, for example, it's been there, you rightly said, 2025, a decision will need to be made whether it is being stopped or they will renew it, and I'm sure there are conversations going on. We know there are conversations going on to see what would that next step be for AGOA. But if you look at Kenya is utilizing, I think, just about 100 of those tariff lines. There are 6,400 tariff lines. Yeah. So being able to just stay tuned to what those opportunities are and looking at our own strengths as a country from a private sector perspective and taking advantage of that. Even the few remaining years of AGOA, I think is definitely right up the alley of the private sector. So we need to step up. As a private sector, we need to step up and be able to leverage these platforms, if I may call them that, that are being created by government to ease that trade that we are all looking for.
You see, the efforts of having a trade agreement between Kenya and the US back then was seen as an effort to try and minimize the influence of China, in the Kenyan market. Because when you look at the trade between Kenya and China, you're talking about more than 370 billion Kenya shillings, compared to the 120 billion US dollars, what are traded between Nairobi and Washington. And so do you think the people who are driving this narrative were right?
Well, if you look at the trade statistics, right now the biggest export market for Kenya is actually the US.
The US, yeah.
Yeah. It is actually the US. Then secondly, if you look at...
I think it's Uganda and then US.
Well, last year, the US became the leading export market for Kenya.
In the last quarter.
Yeah. So that's one. Then two, if you look at the period between 2016 and 2019, in terms of total investment flows, about 1.17 billion US, China 408 or thereabouts million. So while there is quite a bit of activity from the Chinese side of things, most of it is actually importation into Kenya. If you look at our like I've said, our export, I think we're doing well there. What we need to do, and where there's a lot of scope to do, is encourage more FDI into the country, and as you said, really leverage AGOA so that we can up even further that 1.2 billion that you've talked about. We are barely scratching the surface. And that's why trade arrangements such as this just want to ensure that there is continuity, there is stability that would allow that to be catalyzed.
You see, when you look at Kenya's export to the US vis-a-vis the imports, you see that we export more goods to the US than we import from the US, because we have a trade deficit of about 27 billion Kenya shillings.
Correct.
In favor of Kenya. And you're saying, and you're right, that there are more than 6,400 line of export that we can exploit to reach the American market. But it is often said that the US has made it somehow very difficult for you to access their markets through conditions and the phytosanitary demands. Is this true?
It is true in the sense that you need to meet certain standards, and those standards apply to everybody. It's not just to Kenyans or Kenyan businesses. Just the same way, if you are to do any form of agriculture trade, since you've mentioned SPS considerations, there are certain standards, there are certain considerations that you must meet to be able to import your product into Kenya. So there's really nothing unusual there. I think where that sort of gap comes in is just that, we are used to a certain standard. There's a certain standard that is required, and we need to rise to meet that standard. Now, having said that, there are Kenyan companies that are actually exporting to the US. The 1.2 billion that you've talked about, apparel, coffee, macadamia, and so many other lines, they are meeting the standards. So I think we just need to relook at that differently and look at what does it take to meet that standard. And we also know that there are programs that support local companies to be able to meet those requirements.
And you put it quite well that free trade agreement or strategic agreement between countries and countries, they are entered in a bid to be driven by the private sector, because the government is not in business. It is the private sector that is in business. What kind of a trade agreement would you expect between the two countries?
A robust one, as much as possible.
How do you define that?
When I say robust, is that it needs to be holistic, in the sense that you're looking at different sectors that can participate on that platform. We are very keen to see a trade agreement that would also bring stability to the policy, sort of your tax reform and environment, that allows for long-term investment to be made. Because, you know, one of the big challenges engaging with multinationals, American multinationals, I want to believe even other multinationals, is the matters relating to the flux when it comes to policy and regulatory environment. So that needs to be stabilized, because investment decisions are long-term, as I said, and you need that that sort of environment to be stable. Then, of course, you know, there are other matters that we are very, very keen on. How to encourage participation of small businesses, because those are the engines that drive our economies on this side, and believe it or not, in the US as well. Digital trade, the digital economy, is also an important one for us. And then agriculture, trade in agriculture, which is the biggest employer here. If we can scale that up, I think those are just a few of the areas that we would like to see enshrined within the trade agreement. Yeah.
And as a private sector, I mean, is there any role that you're playing to try and drive this agenda?
Yes, absolutely. We provide input from a private sector perspective on the various negotiating positions, the areas, the pillars that have been identified. So, for example, the STIP has identified, I think there are about 11 or 12 areas that they are looking at for this particular phase. So we have actually given submissions on those, both on the US side to the USTR and the Kenyan side as well, through the Ministry of Investments, Trade and Industry. So our role is to provide input from a private sector perspective for consideration as they work through the various pillars of the agreement.
And before I let you go, Maxwell, are you of the opinion that this conversation or these trade negotiations are moving at the desired pace?
As with any such negotiation, as I said, they do take time, but we would like to see a faster pace, just so that, you know, we are able to have this in place and we can confidently leverage that from a private sector perspective. But the pace really is something that it's not unusual, let me put it that way. And so we will keep advocating for this to just move, and we will provide our input as we keep going forward. And I think related to that, just to add impetus to these processes, we are hosting a business summit at the end of March, 29th and 30th of March, that is going to bring together in one place American businesses, local businesses in Kenya and the region, the US government, Kenya governments as well, Kenya governments and the governments of those regions, to do two things. One, drive dialogue around policy and regulatory issues that will help advance trade and investment. And two, and equally important, catalyze commercial engagement. We want companies to connect with each other, initiate commercial opportunities or commercial discussions amongst them, and hopefully close deals. Because even as you have that negotiation going on, the private sector is burning rubber. They need to move. Yep. And so I just want to encourage Kenyans to watch that space. Companies that are interested in participating in this can go to www.amchambizsummit.com. That's AMCHAM. BIZSUMMIT.co. .com. So amchambizsummit.com.
Is the meeting open to members of the public?
It is open to businesses. they can register and participate.
So this is not a meeting whereby it is open to members of the public not to come and listen?
No. It's a business. It's a business forum.
Very good.
Yeah.
It's good to clear that.
Yes.
Maxwell Okello, thank you very much indeed for joining us here this morning. And now it's almost coming to 12 to help us understand where are we in terms of these strategic negotiations, and of course helping us with your insight. Of course, it is the desire of us as a country, and I want to believe of the Americans, to have these conversations completed so that the private sector can start to feel the impacts and the benefits of this two-way traffic investment.
Absolutely.
Very well. Asante sana, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Maxwell Okello is the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce, joining us this morning, and now it's afternoon, to help us put into perspective where the US-Kenya trade relationship are and how they can be fast-tracked. And of course, you have heard it from him. And earlier on, we had a very interesting conversation around cryptocurrency and why you need to get into this space and what you need to know and what you need to do. Well, it has been 2 hours of fruitful conversation with me, O'Brien, and my host, or my guest, that is. Well, we have to come to the end of this conversation because Tamarini is coming up next with Zainab. Otherwise, from me and the rest of business team, thank you so very much indeed for joining us. And remember, today is Thursday. We also have our business news segment at 9 p.m. And so you do want to keep it right here for that. And after Tamarini, we shall be having our 1 o'clock bulletin. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.